Stira, the single word shattered the silence of courtroom 4B like a gunshot echoing through a cathedral. Every head turned toward the voice, young, trembling, but unmistakably determined, as if pulled by invisible strings. The sound seemed to reverberate off the mahogany-paneled walls, bouncing between the carved wooden benches and the tall windows that let in streams of afternoon sunlight. There, in the gallery's third row, sat an 11-year-old boy with sandy hair that caught the fluorescent lighting and eyes that held far too much knowing for his age. His small hand gripped the wooden bench with such intensity that his knuckles had gone white, the tendons standing out like piano wires under his pale skin. His body was half risen from his seat, as if pulled upward by some magnetic force, every muscle tense with barely contained emotion, as he stared at the woman at the defendant's table. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who had presided over thousands of cases in her distinguished career, paused mid-sentence, her gavel hovering in the air like a conductor's baton frozen in time. Her black robes, which usually made her appear imposing and authoritative, suddenly seemed to hang loose around her surprised frame. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably near the door, unsure whether this interruption constituted a disturbance that required intervention. Lawyers on both sides stopped shuffling their papers, their practiced composure cracking like ice under spring thaw as they tried to understand what was happening in their carefully orchestrated legal proceeding. Even the court reporter's fingers froze above her keys, her stenotype machine falling silent for the first time that morning, the sudden absence of its rhythmic clicking creating an eerie vacuum of sound that made every breath audible. Amira Johnson's breath caught in her throat, the sound sharp and painful in the sudden stillness that had descended over the room like a heavy blanket. Her legal pad slipped from trembling fingers, pages scattering like fallen leaves in an autumn wind, as she turned, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain everyone in the courtroom could hear it. And there he was, Benjamin. Her Benjamin. The child she had loved with every fiber of her being, raised with infinite patience and tenderness, and been forced to abandon in what felt like another lifetime, another universe where different rules applied, and love was allowed to flourish without interference from fear and pride, and the cold calculations of broken men. The boy she thought she'd never see again, standing there like a ghost made flesh. Okseben! She whispered, her professional composure so carefully maintained through years of legal training and courtroom experience cracking completely like a dam bursting under pressure that had been building for 5 long years. Her voice carried across the courtroom raw with suppressed longing and carefully buried grief that threatened to overwhelm her completely, to drag her under waves of memory and regret and love that had never died, despite time and distance and forced silence. Behind him sat Richard Carter, his expensive Italian suit unable to hide the way his entire body had gone rigid with shock, as if someone had just delivered a physical blow to his solar plexus. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, surprise, fear, recognition, and something that might have been shame, or perhaps the dawning realization of a reckoning that had been years in the making. This was the same man who had written her a check 5 years ago, his signature bold and decisive on paper, that was supposed to buy her silence and sever the bond between her and his son forever, as if love could be purchased like any other commodity in his business empire. The courthouse seemed to hold its breath as past and present collided in ways that no one in that room could have anticipated when they'd arrived that morning for what should have been a routine custody hearing. Here was a place where justice was supposed to be served with blind impartiality, where truth was meant to prevail over deception and manipulation, where the innocent were protected and the guilty held accountable for their actions. And yet, in this moment, it felt like the very air was thick with secrets that had festered in darkness for far too long, poisoning everything they touched with their toxic presence. But some bonds Amira was about to learn cannot be bought with any amount of money. Some love runs deeper than pride, deeper than fear, deeper than the walls we build around our hearts, to protect ourselves from the very connections that might save us from our own destructive impulses. Some truths have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply they've been buried, rising like flowers through concrete, beautiful and impossible, and utterly unstoppable in their determination to reach the light. The woman who had once sung lullabies to a grieving child, who had helped him draw fantastical creatures, and promised him that trees remembered everything, looked into the eyes of that same child, now older, but still carrying wounds that should never have been his to bear. And in that look, that moment of recognition, that transcended time and circumstance, and all the careful lies that had been constructed between them, both of them understood with perfect clarity that this was not coincidence. This was not the random working of fate or the meaningless intersection of parallel lives. This was destiny finally claiming what had always belonged to it. But how had they arrived at this moment of impossible reunion? How had a family been torn apart by fear and pride, and the misguided belief that love could be controlled like a business transaction, only to find themselves brought together again in the most unexpected place imaginable? The answer begins 5 years earlier in a mansion filled with grief and shadows, where a little boy, who had already lost too much, was about to discover that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of inflicting the deepest wounds. What happens when the past collides with the present in the most unexpected way? Keep watching to discover how a chance encounter in a courtroom will unravel years of buried secrets and challenge everything we believe about love, loyalty, and the bonds that truly matter. 5 years earlier, rain drummed against the tall windows of the Carter mansion with the persistence of memories that refuse to be forgotten. Each drop a tiny percussion note in a symphony of grief that had been playing for months without pause or respite. The sound echoed through empty hallways and rooms that felt too large, too quiet, too full of the absence of laughter that had once filled every corner with warmth and life. Amira Johnson stepped through the imposing front door, for the first time her heart heavy with purpose and hope in equal measure, carrying a worn leather suitcase that contained not just her belongings, but her dreams of making a real difference in a child's life. She had answered an advertisement that was surprisingly simple for such a prestigious position, found buried in the classified section of the Sunday newspaper, like a secret waiting to be discovered by exactly the right person. Nanny needed for sensitive child. Experience with grief preferred. Discretion essential. Competitive compensation for the right candidate. The words had spoken to something deep within her soul, a calling that went beyond mere employment, to something that felt like destiny knocking on her door with gentle but insistent fingers. The mansion itself was a testament to success and sorrow, in equal measure its marble floors, gleaming under crystal chandeliers that cast fractured rainbows on walls lined with expensive artwork that no one seemed to notice anymore. Fresh flowers arrived weekly from the same exclusive florist who had provided arrangements for the funeral 6 months earlier, but their beauty felt forced and artificial, like putting makeup on grief in hopes of making it more palatable to visitors who no longer came. Everything was perfectly maintained by a staff of professionals, impeccably clean and arranged with museum-like precision, yet utterly devoid of the warmth and chaos that makes a house feel like a home. Richard Carter stood in the marble foyer waiting for her, his expensive Italian suit hand-tailored on Savile Row, and worth more than most people made in months, unable to hide the bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to emanate from his very core like fog rising from warm earth on a cold morning. At 42, he should have been in his prime commanding boardrooms and building his real estate empire with the ruthless confidence that had made him one of the city's most successful developers. His company, Carter Holdings, owned half the commercial district and was expanding into luxury residential development at a pace that had earned him features in Fortune magazine and invitations to the most exclusive charity galas in the city. Instead, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in the span of months, as if grief had stolen years from his life and replaced them with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions that echoed through rooms too large and too empty. His dark hair, usually perfectly styled for board meetings and client presentations, showed threads of premature silver that hadn't been there before his wife's diagnosis. His hands, when he shook hers in greeting, trembled almost imperceptibly with the exhaustion that comes from carrying too much weight for too long without anyone to share the burden. "Mr. Carter," Amira said softly, extending her hand with the gentle confidence of someone who understood that first impressions could mean the difference between hope and despair for a grieving family. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this must be an incredibly difficult time." He shook her hand briefly, his grip firm but distant, as if he was afraid that too much human contact might crack the carefully constructed armor he had built around his emotions. "My son Benjamin has been having a difficult time since his mother passed away," he said, his voice carrying the weight of repeated failures and sleepless nights. "The previous 3 nannies didn't work out. They found him challenging." What he didn't say, what hung in the air like an unspoken truth too painful to voice, was that Benjamin had barely spoken to anyone in the 6 months since cancer had taken his mother with the cruel efficiency of a thief in the night. The boy who had once filled the vast house with the sound of running feet and spontaneous laughter now moved through it like a ghost, silent and unreachable, as if he had learned that loving someone meant losing them, and had decided that silence was infinitely safer than connection. Margaret Carter had been the heart and soul of their home, the one who had filled the formal spaces with warmth and the sound of music drifting from the kitchen as she prepared meals with love instead of duty. She had been a teacher before marriage, someone who understood children in ways that went beyond mere instruction to genuine emotional connection. Her illness had been swift and merciless, stealing her piece by piece until the vibrant woman who had danced barefoot in the kitchen while making breakfast was reduced to a frail figure in a hospital bed, fighting battles she couldn't win against an enemy that showed no mercy. Amira found Benjamin in the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound books that stretched from floor to coffered ceiling, their spines creating a tapestry of knowledge that seemed to swallow the small figure curled in an oversized leather chair that had probably belonged to his grandfather. 8 years old, but carrying himself with the careful stillness of someone much older, someone who had learned that sudden movements might draw unwanted attention, and attention might lead to more questions he wasn't ready to answer. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises, evidence of too many sleepless nights, and his school uniform, crisp white shirt and navy blazer with the prestigious Riverside Academy crest, hung loose on his slight frame, testament to meals half-eaten and an appetite stolen by grief. "Hello, Benjamin," she said gently, not approaching too quickly. Years of working with traumatized children had taught her that they were like wounded animals. They needed space and time to decide whether this new person represented safety or just another potential source of pain and disappointment. "I'm Amira. I was hoping we might be friends." He looked up from his book. Something about dinosaurs. She noticed those mighty creatures that had once ruled the world, and then vanished, leaving only traces of their existence behind in fossils and memories, and studied her face with an intensity that caught her completely off guard. There was intelligence there, sharp and bright, despite the sorrow that clouded it, like storm clouds obscuring the sun. There was pain, yes, but also something else, a flicker of hope, that he was trying very hard to hide, as if hope itself had become dangerous, a luxury he could no longer afford. Are you going to leave too? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, each word carefully chosen and weighted with the accumulated fear of a child who had already lost far too much in his short life. The question hit Amira like a physical blow to the chest, stealing her breath and making her heart ache with the recognition of just how much this little boy had endured. How many people had this child watched walk away from his life? How many promises had been broken by adults who claimed they cared? How many times had he opened his heart only to have it closed again by circumstances beyond his control or understanding? I'm going to try very hard not to, she answered, with absolute honesty, because she had learned that children possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect dishonesty, sensing lies like animals could sense approaching storms. But I need you to help me understand how to stay. Can you teach me what you need? The honesty seemed to surprise him. Most adults made promises they couldn't keep, spoke in platitudes designed to comfort rather than connect. This woman was different. She was asking for his help, treating him like a partner in his own care, rather than a problem to be solved or managed. Over the following weeks, Amira began to see glimpses of the remarkable boy Benjamin had been, before grief had taken hold of his young life like ivy, growing over a beautiful building, obscuring its architecture, but never truly destroying what lay beneath. She discovered his passion for drawing wild, imaginative pictures of fantastical creatures and distant worlds, where mothers didn't get sick and families stayed together forever. His artwork covered the walls of his bedroom, creating a gallery of dreams and possibilities that spoke to a creativity that grief hadn't been able to completely extinguish. She learned he was brilliant at mathematics, able to solve complex problems in his head, with a speed that amazed his teachers and left them scrambling to provide more challenging material. But he struggled to concentrate since his mother's death, his mind often drifting to memories that pulled him away from the present moment, like an invisible undertow dragging him back to happier times that felt increasingly distant and unreal. Most importantly, she realized he was starving for genuine human connection, for someone who wouldn't treat his sorrow as something to be fixed quickly and efficiently, like a broken appliance that needed repair and could then be forgotten. He needed someone who understood that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a journey to be walked, preferably with someone who cared enough to match his pace rather than push him forward before he was ready. But their growing bond hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone in the Carter household. Sylvia Kane Richards, senior assistant, watched their developing relationship with growing disapproval that she disguised behind a carefully constructed mask of professional concern. A sharp woman in her mid-30s with ambitious gray eyes and a talent for manipulation that she had honed over years of corporate ladder climbing. Sylvia had her own carefully laid plans for the Carter family's future plans that definitely didn't include a nanny who might gain too much emotional influence over both father and son. Sylvia had worked for Richard for 5 years, arriving just before his wife's diagnosis and staying through the darkest period of his life with the dedication of someone who understood that loyalty during crisis could be richly rewarded with opportunity. She had positioned herself as absolutely indispensable, the one person who could manage his impossible schedule, handle his most sensitive correspondence, and keep his multi-million-dollar business running smoothly while his personal life fell apart around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Mr. Carter," she said. During one of their morning briefings, her voice carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than calculating each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I hate to bring this up, but I've noticed some concerning behavior patterns developing." Richard looked up from his laptop where he had been reviewing proposals for a new luxury development project that could potentially expand Carter Holdings into an entirely new market segment. Irritation flickered across his features like a candle flame in a draft. He had little patience for office politics at the best of times, and especially not when it came to matters concerning Benjamin's care and well-being. "What kind of behavior are you referring to, Sylvia?" "The nanny Amira, she's become quite emotionally attached to Benjamin, and he to her. Perhaps unhealthily so." Sylvia paused deliberately, letting her carefully chosen words sink in like drops of slow-acting poison in clear water. "I've observed him refusing to go to bed unless she's physically present in the room. He won't eat meals that have been prepared by anyone else on the staff. It's as if he's attempting to replace his mother with her, which could be psychologically damaging in the long term." The words were carefully chosen and strategically delivered, designed to trigger every fear Richard harbored about his son's psychological well-being and his own glaring failures as a father. Since his wife's death, he had thrown himself into work with the desperate intensity of a drowning man clinging to a life raft, telling himself it was all for Benjamin's future, to build something secure and lasting that loss couldn't touch. But the truth was infinitely simpler and more painful. He had absolutely no idea how to be the kind of father his son desperately needed. "What exactly are you suggesting I should do about this situation? Perhaps it would be better to transition to someone else before Benjamin becomes even more emotionally dependent on her presence. It might be kinder to him in the long run before the attachment becomes even deeper and more difficult to sever." Meanwhile, something genuinely beautiful was happening between Amira and Benjamin, a connection that transcended the typical employer-employee relationship and moved into territory that felt almost sacred. She taught him that grief wasn't something to be fixed quickly with medication or therapy, but rather a journey to be walked with patience and compassion. She encouraged his artistic endeavors, his endless questions about the world, his slow but steady return to trusting that perhaps not all adults would disappoint him. But Richard was watching now, really watching their interactions for the first time since Amira's arrival. He saw how Benjamin's entire face would light up like a Christmas tree when she entered a room, how he sought her approval for everything from his homework to his choice of breakfast cereal, how he trusted her with the most fragile pieces of his healing heart pieces that remained stubbornly locked away from his own father, despite Richard's clumsy attempts at connection. And Richard felt something unexpected and deeply uncomfortable growing in his chest: jealousy. Not romantic jealousy, which would have been easier to understand and dismiss, but something far more primal and shameful: the bitter sting of watching someone else succeed completely where he had failed so spectacularly. Someone else had found the key to his son's guarded soul, and it would never ever be him. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who plant the seeds of our greatest mistakes. Stay with us as this family's foundation begins to crack under the weight of whispered doubts and hidden agendas. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the world outside was celebrating renewal, while inside the Carter mansion, something beautiful was about to be destroyed with the surgical precision of a corporate decision. Richard had spent the weekend watching Benjamin and Amira together, really watching them for perhaps the first time since she'd been hired, and what he saw both warmed his heart and filled him with a cold dread that he couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. He watched his son light up when Amira entered a room, the way Benjamin's entire posture changed from guarded stillness to animated engagement, as if someone had flipped a switch that brought him fully to life. He saw how the boy sought her approval for everything from his artwork to his choice of breakfast cereal, how he trusted her with the fragile pieces of his healing heart that he had kept locked away from everyone else, including his own father. He witnessed small miracles that should have filled him with gratitude. Benjamin laughing at one of Amira's gentle jokes, Benjamin asking for seconds at dinner for the first time in months, Benjamin sleeping through the night without the nightmares that had plagued him since his mother's death. And Richard felt something he hadn't expected, something that twisted in his gut like a knife turning slowly jealousy. Not romantic jealousy that would have been simpler to understand and dismiss. This was something deeper and more shameful, the bitter sting of watching someone else succeed where he had failed so completely and publicly. Someone else had found the key to his son's locked-away soul, and it wasn't him. It would never be him. The realization came to him as he stood in the doorway of Benjamin's room on Sunday night, watching Amira read a bedtime story with voices and expressions that brought the characters to vivid life. She was doing the dragon voice that Benjamin loved, making her voice deep and growly, while her eyes sparkled with mischief. Benjamin was curled against her side, his small body relaxed and trusting in a way Richard hadn't seen since before Margaret's illness. His eyes bright with interest. For the first time in months, occasionally interrupting to ask questions or make observations that showed his sharp mind was fully engaged. It was a picture of domestic peace that should have filled Richard with gratitude and relief. His son was healing. His son was happy. His son was learning to trust again, to open his heart to the possibility that love didn't always end in loss. Instead, it filled him with a rage so pure and unexpected that it left him breathless, gasping for air in the hallway outside his son's room, like a man who had been punched in the solar plexus. That night, he called Sylvia at home, something he had never done before, except in cases of genuine business emergency. She answered on the second ring, her voice carefully modulated to sound surprised, but pleased by the unexpected contact. "Richard, is everything all right? I've been thinking about what you said, about Benjamin and the nanny." There was a pause, and when Sylvia spoke again, her voice carried a note of satisfaction that she tried to disguise as concern. "I see. Have you noticed the behaviors I mentioned, among others?" Richard's voice was tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I think you're right. This needs to be handled delicately, but it needs to be handled." Amira. He called from his study the next morning, his voice carrying the cold authority he used in boardrooms when lesser men tried to challenge his decisions. The tone was designed to establish hierarchy immediately, to remind everyone in the room who held the power and who would be making the final decisions. "Could I see you for a moment?" She found him behind his massive oak desk, a piece of furniture that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, its surface gleaming with the kind of polish that spoke to old money and established power. A check was already written and lying face down on the leather surface like a secret, waiting to be revealed, like evidence of a crime not yet committed. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone and corporate training, but there was something in his eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before, as if something fundamental had shifted overnight, as if a decision had been made that couldn't be unmade. Behind him, the windows looked out onto manicured gardens, where his wife had once grown roses, where Benjamin had played on a swing set that now stood empty, creaking in the wind like a monument to happier times. "Please sit down." Amira remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning. Something was wrong. Something had changed. She could feel it in the air between them, like the pressure that builds before a storm breaks, electric and dangerous and full of potential for destruction. "Is everything all right? Is it Benjamin?" "Benjamin is exactly the problem." Richard's voice was measured, controlled, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, designed to cut cleanly and without unnecessary damage. "I've been thinking about his attachment to you. It's become unhealthy, inappropriate. The words hit her like a slap, unexpected and sharp. "I don't understand. So you're not his mother, Amira." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw her flinch as if he had struck her physically. The reaction should have made him feel guilty, should have made him reconsider the path he was choosing. But instead, it only confirmed what he had already decided: this had gone too far. He's confused. Grief makes children do that. They latch onto replacement figures. It's not healthy for his development. Amira's hands clenched at her sides, her professional training warring with the maternal instincts that Benjamin had awakened in her over the past months. Benjamin is healing. He's starting to trust again, to open up. He's becoming dependent. Richard stood moving around the desk with predatory precision, using his height and position to establish dominance in a conversation that he needed to win at all costs. What happens when you decide to leave, when you get married, have your own family? What happens to Benjamin then? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over everything they had built together, sharp and gleaming and ready to fall. Because the truth was, Amira had thought about it. She was 28 in the prime of her life, and there was a man, Marcus, who had been patiently waiting for her to have room in her life for something beyond her work with the Carters. They had been dating for 2 years before she took the position, and she could see the growing frustration in his eyes every time she chose Benjamin's needs over their dinner plans or weekend getaways, every time she canceled their dates because the boy had a nightmare or needed help with a school project. Marcus was a good man, patient and understanding, but she could feel him pulling away as she became more invested in Benjamin's welfare. He wanted to get married, to start a family of their own, to build something that belonged to them rather than living in the shadow of someone else's grief. Richard picked up the check and held it out to her, the paper crisp and clean, representing more money than she had ever seen at one time. The amount was staggering enough to change her life completely, to open doors that had always been closed to someone of her background and circumstances. This is 6 months' salary, plus a significant bonus. Enough to start fresh somewhere else to build the life you deserve. All I ask is that you make it clean. No long goodbye, no promises to stay in touch. Just gone. Amira stared at the check, without taking it, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what he was asking. The numbers seemed to dance on the paper, mocking her with their generosity, their complete disconnection from the emotional reality of what they represented. You're asking me to abandon him. I'm asking you to do what's best for him. Richard's voice softened slightly, and for a moment she saw past his corporate armor to the frightened father underneath the man who was drowning in his own inadequacy and lashing out at the one person who had managed to reach his son. He needs to learn to rely on family, on me. I can't do that while he's looking to you for everything he needs. And what if you're wrong? Amira asked quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. What if taking away another person he loves breaks something in him that can't be repaired? Richard's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his skin, like a trapped animal struggling against confinement. That's my risk to take. He's my son. The truth of it hit Amira like a physical blow, stunning in its simplicity and finality. Benjamin wasn't her son, no matter how much she loved him, no matter how much he needed her, no matter how perfectly they fit together, like pieces of a puzzle that had been searching for completion. She had no rights, no say in his future, no legal standing to fight for what she knew was best for him. She was an employee, nothing more easily dismissed and replaced like any other piece of household staff. If I refuse, then I'll find a reason to fire you. Poor performance concerning behavior with my son. I'll create a paper trail that will make it difficult for you to find similar work anywhere in the city. His voice was quiet but implacable, carrying the weight of a man who had built an empire by knowing exactly how much pressure to apply to get what he wanted. This way you leave with your reputation intact and enough money to build something new, something that belongs to you. When love collides with power, who really pays the price? The next few minutes will reveal the true cost of this impossible choice and the devastating ripple effects that follow. 3 days later, Amira was gone from the Carter mansion, vanished from Benjamin's life, as suddenly and completely as if she had never existed at all. The absence felt like a physical wound in the house, a silence so profound and unnatural that even the usually bustling household staff moved through the hallways with hushed voices and careful steps, as if loud sounds might somehow disturb the grief that had settled over everything, like a thick layer of dust on abandoned furniture. She had written Benjamin a letter, a careful, loving explanation that she desperately hoped might soften the devastating blow of her departure. In it, she tried to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of an adult world that often made no sense at all, especially to a child who had already been forced to bear more loss than any 8-year-old should ever have to endure. She wrote about how much he meant to her, how incredibly proud she was of his progress and growth, how she would carry the memory of their time together, like precious treasures in her heart, for the rest of her life. She told him about the trees he loved so much, reminded him that they remembered everything, every person who had ever sat beneath their branches, every secret that had been whispered to their ancient roots, and promised him that even though she couldn't be there with him physically, she would always be somewhere in the world, loving him and believing in his potential. But Richard intercepted the letter before Benjamin ever had a chance to see it, adding it to a locked file in his desk drawer. Along with the contract, Amira had signed a copy of the check that had purchased her silence and a legally binding non-disclosure agreement that prevented her from ever attempting to contact the family again. Instead, Benjamin woke up that Wednesday morning to find his father sitting alone in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His face a carefully constructed mask of controlled emotion that didn't quite manage to hide the guilt eating away at him from the inside like acid. "Where's Amira?" Benjamin asked, his voice still thick with sleep and innocent expectation. He was wearing his favorite dinosaur pajamas, the ones she had helped him pick out during a rare shopping trip that had somehow turned into a magical adventure through the toy store, where she had listened with genuine interest to his encyclopedic knowledge about different species and geological eras. Richard couldn't bring himself to look up from his coffee cup, couldn't bear to meet his son's trusting eyes and watch that trust shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "She had to go away, son. There was a family emergency that required her immediate attention. When will she come back to us?" "She won't be coming back, Benjamin." The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would disturb the peace of their relationship for years to come, spreading outward in ever-widening circles of consequence and pain that neither of them could fully foresee in that moment. Benjamin stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his dinosaur pajamas, his young mind struggling desperately to process what he had just heard. The kitchen that had become a place of warmth and spontaneous laughter during Amira's tenure suddenly felt cold and foreign, as if he had somehow wandered into the wrong house entirely. "Did I do something wrong?" He whispered, his voice so small and fragile it barely carried across the distance between them. Richard finally forced himself to look at his son, and what he saw there almost shattered his resolve completely. Benjamin's face had gone pale as winter moonlight drained of all color, except for the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent worrying about things beyond his control. His eyes were wide with the kind of primal terror that comes from having the ground suddenly disappear beneath your feet. The same look he had worn in the hospital when the doctors had gently explained that Mommy wouldn't be coming home this time. "No, Ben, You didn't do anything wrong at all. Then why did she leave without saying goodbye? These things just happen sometimes in the adult world. You'll understand when you're older. But Benjamin already understood far more than his father realized, or gave him credit for. He understood with devastating clarity that people left without warning or explanation. He understood that loving someone with your whole heart didn't guarantee they would choose to stay. He understood that the world was fundamentally an unsafe place where the people you needed most could simply vanish from your life, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and broken promises and the echo of laughter that would never come again. The boy who had been slowly, painfully healing, who had started to laugh again and dream again and believe that maybe life could be good despite loss, retreated back into his protective shell, but this time the withdrawal was deeper and more complete than before. If his mother's death had been a wound inflicted by circumstances completely beyond anyone's control, Amira's sudden abandonment felt like a deliberate betrayal, a conscious choice made by someone who had claimed to love him. Richard hired Mrs. Henderson within the week, an older woman with impeccable references, who was everything Amira hadn't been: emotionally distant, rigorously professional, focused exclusively on practical needs rather than emotional connection. She ensured that Benjamin ate his meals on schedule and completed his homework assignments and arrived at school punctually. But she never read bedtime stories with different character voices, never encouraged wild artistic endeavors, never promised that trees had perfect memories, and nothing good was ever truly lost forever. Months passed with the grinding inevitability of seasons changing. Then a year. Benjamin functioned adequately on the surface. He attended school, completed assignments, ate his meals, said please and thank you, and demonstrated all the outward signs of a well-behaved child. But the inner light that Amira had helped rekindle remained stubbornly dim, hidden behind walls that grew thicker and more impenetrable with each passing day. And every single night, in the absolute privacy of his locked bedroom, he wrote letters he would never send. Dear Amira, today was my first day of 4th grade. I wanted to tell you about my new teacher, Mrs. Williams, who has a funny laugh that sounds exactly like a hiccup and keeps a tank full of colorful fish that she lets us name. But then I remembered you're not here anymore. Dad says you had a family emergency, but sometimes I think maybe you just decided you didn't want to stay with us anymore. I hope your family's okay now. I hope you're happy wherever you are. Love always, Benjamin. The letters became a sacred ritual, a way of maintaining some form of connection to someone who might as well have been living on another planet, for all the contact they were allowed to have. Each one was meticulously written in his best handwriting, filled with the daily details and small observations of a life that felt increasingly hollow and meaningless without someone to share it with who truly understood him. Richard discovered the letters by pure accident when Benjamin was 10 years old, hidden in a battered shoebox during what should have been a routine search for a missing homework assignment. He sat on his son's bedroom floor, surrounded by the innocent detritus of childhood baseball cards and toy cars and art supplies, reading page after page of careful handwriting, each letter serving as a window into emotional pain that had been growing in complete silence for years. The guilt that had been gnawing steadily at the edges of his conscience suddenly exploded into full consciousness, threatening to consume him entirely with its overwhelming intensity. What terrible thing had he done? What irreplaceable treasure had he stolen from both his son and the woman who had so clearly loved him with the fierce devotion of a mother's heart? But pride, that stubborn, destructive pride that had built his business empire at the cost of his family's happiness, kept him from taking any corrective action. To reach out to Amira now would mean publicly admitting that he had been catastrophically wrong, that his jealousy and fear had destroyed something beautiful and necessary and irreplaceable. So he carefully returned the letters to their hiding place, and told himself there was nothing to be done about past decisions. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Amira had painstakingly rebuilt her shattered life piece by careful piece, like someone assembling a complex puzzle with infinite patience, despite knowing that the final picture would never look quite the same as before. The money Richard had given her allowed her to return to law school, to complete her degree with academic honors while working part-time at a legal aid clinic that specialized in helping families navigate crisis situations. She told herself it was pure coincidence that she had chosen this particular career path, but in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, she knew better. Every child she helped was in some small but significant way Benjamin. Every family she fought to keep together was the family she had been forced to abandon. Every case involving custody disputes or parental rights felt intensely personal in ways that sometimes surprised her colleagues with their emotional intensity. She never married Marcus despite his patient persistence and genuine affection. He had been understanding about her dedication to her work and the long hours it demanded, but he couldn't comprehend the shadow that would sometimes fall across her face when she glimpsed a boy with sandy hair, or the way she seemed to be perpetually listening for something that never came. The case Amira was working on should have been completely routine by now. After 3 intensive years at the Children's Rights Foundation, she had successfully handled dozens of similar custody disputes, each one a heartbreaking variation on the same fundamental theme of families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control or understanding. But there was something about this particular situation, involving 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, that had gotten under her professional skin in a way that surprised her with its intensity and refused to let go no matter how hard she tried to maintain emotional distance. Perhaps it was the way Emma clutched her worn teddy bear throughout every court proceeding, the stuffed animal clearly serving as both comfort object and security blanket in a world that had become unpredictable and frightening through no fault of her own. Or maybe it was how the little girl's dark eyes held exactly the same variety of guarded hope that Amira remembered seeing in another child's face in what felt like another lifetime, that careful wariness of someone who had learned through bitter experience not to trust too quickly or love too openly, because adults had a tendency to make promises they couldn't or wouldn't keep. Emma's father, Carlos Rodriguez, was fighting desperately to regain meaningful visitation rights after completing an 18-month addiction recovery program that had cost him his marriage, his job, and very nearly his life. His journey back to sobriety had been genuinely commendable. Regular attendance at support group meetings, steady employment as an automotive mechanic, a modest apartment in a safe neighborhood, and most importantly, a sincere desire to rebuild the relationship with the daughter he had failed so catastrophically during the darkest period of his addiction. But the legal system moved with glacial slowness when children's welfare was at stake, and Emma's grandmother, who had been granted temporary custody during the worst of Carlos's addiction, remained understandably reluctant to allow unsupervised visits until she could be absolutely certain that he wouldn't relapse and put Emma through another devastating cycle of disappointment and abandonment. She had absolutely no idea that Benjamin Carter was sitting in the gallery that day, having convinced his school's guidance counselor that attending real court proceedings was an essential part of an independent study project on the American justice system that he was pursuing for extra academic credit. Mrs. Patterson, the well-meaning counselor, had been genuinely impressed by Benjamin's apparent initiative and academic maturity, never suspecting for a moment that this seemingly responsible 11-year-old had been systematically researching his legal options for the past 6 months, with the methodical precision of someone far beyond his chronological years. The research had begun the previous autumn when Benjamin finally gathered enough courage to do something he had been contemplating for months: gain access to his father's personal computer system. It wasn't malicious hacking in any traditional sense. Benjamin had inherited his mother's razor-sharp intelligence and his father's strategic thinking abilities, along with a natural aptitude for technology that had consistently impressed his teachers since elementary school and made him the unofficial technical support specialist for several of his less computer-savvy classmates. What he discovered buried in those digital files shattered his carefully constructed understanding of his own life story, like a hammer blow to crystal. The contract was buried deep within a folder labeled Household Personnel, filed between routine tax documents and property deeds, as if Amira's termination had been nothing more than another mundane business transaction. No more emotionally significant than hiring a landscaping service or renewing a commercial insurance policy. But the contents told a story that made Benjamin's stomach clench with a nauseating mixture of rage and betrayal that left him feeling physically sick for days afterward. Payment schedules, detailed non-disclosure agreements, specific termination clauses, and most damning of all, a receipt for a check written to A. Johnson for termination of services and confidentiality guarantee, in an amount that represented more money than Benjamin's young mind could even begin to comprehend. Amira hadn't left because of any family emergency. She hadn't abandoned him because he was somehow difficult or unlovable or not worth the effort of staying. She had been deliberately paid to disappear from his life, bought off like a witness in a criminal trial, forced to choose between her own financial security and the relationship that had become the emotional center of both their worlds. The discovery sent Benjamin into a rage that surprised him, with its white-hot intensity and crystalline purity. For years, 5 long, painful years, he had blamed himself for not being somehow enough to make her want to stay. He had carried the crushing weight of another abandonment like a physical burden that grew heavier, with each passing day convinced himself that there was something fundamentally flawed and unlovable about his essential nature, that drove people away no matter how desperately he tried to be good, to be worthy, to be the kind of child that adults wanted to keep in their lives. To learn that the entire devastating sequence of events had been coldly orchestrated by his own father, the one person in the world who was supposed to protect him from harm and advocate for his best interests above all other considerations, shifted something fundamental and irreversible in Benjamin's understanding of how the world actually worked. Now, sitting in that courtroom and watching Amira argue with passionate eloquence for a child's fundamental right to maintain meaningful relationships with the adults who loved them, Benjamin felt the final pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a master lock opening to reveal treasures that had been hidden for far too long. This was what she did now with her life. This was who she had chosen to become. Someone who fought tirelessly for children exactly like him, children who desperately needed advocates in a world where adults routinely made decisions that prioritized their own convenience over genuine connection, their need for control over their capacity for love, their fear of vulnerability over their faith in the fundamental resilience of the human heart. Her voice carried across the courtroom with quiet but unmistakable authority as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we're not simply talking about abstract legal rights in this case. We're talking about a little girl's fundamental psychological need to feel genuinely loved and wanted by both of her parents, even when those relationships require careful supervision and ongoing professional support." Benjamin watched with transfixed attention as this woman who had once sung him lullabies in different character voices and helped him draw fantastical creatures and promised him that trees possessed perfect memories now wielded legal knowledge like a finely honed sword in defense of another child's happiness and emotional well-being. When the session finally ended and the courtroom began to empty with the usual shuffle of departing spectators and legal professionals, Benjamin slipped away from his assigned guardian and made his way toward the front of the room where Amira was methodically gathering her papers and legal documents, 5 years' worth of carefully stored words, suddenly crowding his throat and threatening to overwhelm his ability to speak coherently. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of people departing and conversations ending. She looked up from her briefcase, and time seemed to stop entirely. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything that had ever happened in the carefully controlled, meticulously organized world that Richard Carter had spent decades constructing around himself. Here, in this public space specifically dedicated to justice and truth, there was absolutely nowhere to hide from the consequences of choices made in fear and pride and the fundamentally misguided belief that love could be regulated and controlled like any other business transaction. "You lied to me," Benjamin said, his young voice carrying an authority and moral weight that surprised all three of them. The words came out clear and strong without the hesitation or uncertainty that typically characterized his interactions with his father. "For 5 entire years, you let me think it was my fault that she left us." Richard's face had gone pale as winter moonlight, all color draining away, as if someone had pulled some essential plug deep inside him, and all his vitality was flowing out through an invisible wound. "Benjamin, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. I understand that you paid her to go away because you were jealous of our relationship." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if Benjamin had been rehearsing this confrontation for months, polishing each accusation until it gleamed with the sharp, cutting edge of absolute truth. "I understand that you thought money could fix everything, just like you always do with every problem in your life." Amira stood frozen between them, watching a conversation that had been building pressure for half a decade finally explode into the open like a dam bursting under accumulated weight. She could see the raw pain etched in both their faces, the son who had felt abandoned and betrayed by the two people who should have protected him most, and the father who had somehow convinced himself that he was protecting what he loved most, even as his actions systematically destroyed it. "I was trying to help you to protect you from future disappointment," Richard said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual commanding corporate tone and reduced to the uncertain whisper of a man who was finally beginning to understand the true magnitude of his mistakes. "I was healing." Benjamin's voice cracked with emotion, and suddenly he was every inch the 11-year-old boy he actually was, not the artificially mature figure he had been trying so hard to project. "She was helping me heal from losing Mom, and you took her away because you couldn't stand that I loved her more than I loved you." The accusation hung in the air between them, like a physical blow, harsh and uncompromising in its brutal honesty. Richard actually staggered backward as if he had been struck, his carefully maintained corporate composure finally crumbling completely under the devastating weight of his son's pain and his own long-suppressed guilt. The fundamental truth of Benjamin's words hit him with the force of divine revelation. That was exactly what he had done. He had allowed jealousy and his own profound insecurity to drive him to destroy the one relationship that had brought genuine joy and healing back into his son's life after tragedy had stolen it away so cruelly. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "What have I done to you? What have I done to both of you?" It was the first time Benjamin had ever seen his father cry, really cry, not just the careful, controlled tears he had shed at his wife's funeral, but the raw, ugly sobs of a man confronting the full weight of his own catastrophic failures. They found themselves in a small conference room deep in the courthouse, the three of them sitting around a scarred wooden table that had undoubtedly witnessed countless other difficult conversations about custody and loss, and all the complex ways that love could both heal and harm. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and unforgiving, casting everything in stark relief, but somehow it felt appropriate for the kind of unflinching truth-telling that was finally taking place. Richard's hands shook visibly as he struggled to find adequate words for feelings he had spent years systematically suppressing behind walls of work and professional achievement, and the desperate belief that success in business could somehow compensate for his spectacular failures in the relationships that actually mattered. I was jealous, he admitted, finally, his voice barely above a whisper, each word dragged from some deep place where he had buried his shame and fear. Not romantically jealous, but something much worse. You were so naturally good with him, Amira, so effortlessly connected to what he needed. Everything I tried felt forced and artificial and completely inadequate. True, it wasn't easy, Amira said softly, her voice carrying the full weight of 5 years spent missing this child, wondering if she had made the right choice, loving someone she couldn't see or hold or comfort when he needed her most. Love is never easy, but it's always worth the effort. Shaki, I thought I was protecting him from experiencing another devastating loss. Richard continued the words, now flowing like water through a broken dam, as 5 years of rationalization and self-justification finally gave way to honest self-examination. I thought if he became too emotionally attached to you, and then you inevitably left to build your own life, your own family, it would destroy him completely. He looked directly at his son, whose face was streaked with tears, but whose eyes remained fixed on his father with unwavering attention, as if he was finally seeing the fallible human being behind the corporate facade for the very first time. I was wrong. I was so terribly, unforgivably wrong. Benjamin reached across the table and took his father's hand, a gesture so simple and yet so profound that both adults had to fight back fresh tears. The touch was tentative at first, testing whether this fragile connection was real or just another thing that might shatter under too much emotional weight. "Oh, I don't need you to be perfect, Dad," Benjamin said quietly, his voice carrying a wisdom that no 11-year-old should ever have needed to develop. "I just need you to be honest with me, to trust me enough to tell me the truth." 3 months later, Amira stood once again in the familiar warmth of the Carter Mansion's library, watching Benjamin excitedly show her his latest artistic creation, a fantastical tree whose spreading branches seemed to hold entire miniature worlds within their embrace. But this time, those imaginary worlds weren't desperate escape routes from an unbearable reality. They were joyful celebrations of life's infinite possibilities. Lantitseon. The roots go all the way down to the very center of the earth, Benjamin explained with infectious enthusiasm, his eyes bright with the kind of wonder she remembered from their earliest days together. And they connect underground to all the other trees in the whole world, so they can share their stories and memories with each other across any distance. "Just like your mother always said," Amira murmured softly, remembering a conversation from what felt like another lifetime. Trees remember absolutely everything. She visited twice a week now, not as an employee, but as something infinitely more precious and harder to define. Family friend, trusted mentor, keeper of Benjamin's heart's deepest truths. Richard had undergone his own transformation, learning slowly but surely how to be genuinely present in ways that money couldn't purchase and corporate success couldn't achieve. "I brought you something special," Amira said carefully, pulling a worn shoebox from her bag. Benjamin's eyes widened with recognition and wonder. "My letters. Your father thought you might want them back." Benjamin held the box as if it contained treasures beyond any earthly price. In many ways, it did 5 years of love that had nowhere to go, hope that had found no outlet, and truth that had finally discovered its voice. "Yeah, some bonds can't be bought or broken," Amira said gently. "They can only be honored. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that love always finds a way home. Subscribe for more stories that prove the bonds that matter most can never truly be broken.